Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for this week's video lecture. Today we're looking at Chapter 5, Society and Inequality in Eurasia and North Africa. In the opening section, Strayer talks about hierarchies and patriarchies remaining more or less unchanged from the time of the classical era until the modern era. Despite the efforts of many, these social inequalities continue even to this day. Nonetheless, the hierarchies and patriarchies of the classical era varied in different second-wave civilizations. So how did these various social systems develop? That's the focus of this chapter. Chinese society is rather unique in that it is shaped much more by state actions than by cultural influence compared to other classical societies. For example, the highest position in the social hierarchy of China was held by government officials. The Han Emperor Wu Di created a formal school in 124 BCE for future bureaucrats to study the Confucian classics as preparation for government service. The curriculum for the school would become the basis for Chinese learning more or less continuously for the next 2,000 years. Entry into the civil service was based on passing a difficult exam on the Confucian classics. The exam was open to all males regardless of social status. There was even an example of a pig farmer who became an imperial advisor. However, as the exam required years of study, those with access to enough wealth to spend time studying for the exam were much more likely to succeed. Thus, the system favored the wealthy. Once the candidate passed the exam and became a civil servant, his social status rose immensely. He was celebrated in his home village or town and was the source of much family pride. The civil servants enjoyed special carriages and fancy robes, as well as various social privileges. They were frequently hailed as symbols of sophistication for their refined behavior and speech. Land and agricultural production had been the major source of wealth in China for millennia. During the Qin dynasty, most land was worked and held by peasant families. During the Han dynasty, though, small-scale farms were displaced by large landowners and tenant farming. During the first century BCE, population pressures, taxation, and indebtedness led wealthier landowners to buy up the land of economically desperate peasants. The wealthy landlords used their increasing power to avoid taxation and raised armies of their own to challenge the state. The emperors and their bureaucrats made repeated attempts to limit the influence of large landowners. State control usually failed, though, but a notable exception is in the case of Wang Mang, a court official who usurped the throne and engaged in a program of nationalizing and redistributing land to peasants and setting limits on the size of land holdings. He provoked a strong reaction from the wealthy elite, though, and his policies eventually led to his assassination. The word gentry is used to denote large landowners. As the landlord class had access to more wealth, they could sponsor their young men to study for the civil service exam. Hence, the government bureaucracy, while open to all who were educated along Confucian lines, was dominated by the wealthy landlords. So the scholar gentry were those who combined the social prestige of government officials with the wealth of the landlord class. Throughout Chinese history, the overwhelming majority of the population had been peasants. While a few may have been able to prosper, most barely survived. In the Han Dynasty, for example, tenant farmers who rented land from landlords would have to pay as much as 2/3 of their crop as rent. Rents, taxes, military service, and forced labor to the state, known as the corvée system, combined with floods and occasional crop failure, all put heavy burdens on the back of Chinese peasants. In hard times, some toiled in poverty and some succumbed to famine, while others fled to cities to become beggars or bandits. Following a series of floods and epidemics, wandering bands of peasants joined together and formed a massive popular movement that reached 360,000 armed followers in 184 of the Common Era. They used Taoism and mystical rituals to unify themselves and called for a coming age of equality and peace. The Han military eventually crushed them, but the rebellion and the military campaign weakened the state, contributing to the eventual dynastic collapse. Besides the fact that scholars who pass the examination are at the top of the social hierarchy, The other unique aspect in China is the fact that merchants and traders are at the bottom. While peasants were poor, they were held in high moral esteem by the Confucian state ideology as the backbone of a healthy society. Merchants, on the other hand, were deemed dishonest and deceitful, and thus of poor moral quality. Furthermore, they were seen as keeping revenue from the state. To keep merchants in check, the state placed various restrictions on them and excluded them from state service. Nonetheless, some merchants found corrupt officials willing to work with them and schemed to put their sons into the Confucian bureaucracy. Merchants were also barred from certain economic activity by state monopolies or forced to loan money to the state. The Portuguese were the first European peoples to have direct contact with Indian societies much later in the early modern era. The word caste, even though it's spelled with an E like it should be caste, it's pronounced caste, comes from the Portuguese word casta, which means race or pure breed. It is a word that they used to try to describe the strict social hierarchy that they found when they began trading with Indians. By 500 BCE, most Indians saw the division of society as timeless and the natural consequence of the world making up the body of Purusha. Each Varna descended from a particular part of Purusha's body. The origins of Varna remain unclear. A conventional explanation points toward an Aryan invasion and subjugation of the indigenous peoples who had darker skin, but this theory has been critiqued by recent scholars. Recent research also indicates that there are a few examples of fluidity between social groups and ways in which non-Aryan groups were incorporated into the religious or warrior castes. These classes of priests, warriors, and commoners were deemed to be elites descended from the Aryan invaders. As elites, they were twice born, once into their bodies and once into their castes. Note that the kings come from the warrior class. This led to occasional conflict between kings and Brahmins. Shudras were held to be non-Aryans who worked as servants of and laborers for the Aryan castes. Originally, the Shudra were likely the survivors of the Indus Valley civilization. Later, though, another category of people beneath the caste ranking and occupying most of the unclean professions came to be known as untouchables. These were usually peoples that were newly incorporated into Indian civilization. Within the four major castes, people divided into jatis, specific professional groups that are similar to guilds. Members of these hereditary groups looked after their own economic interest and policed their members. As professions proliferated in an increasingly complex society, hundreds and then thousands of jatis structured the employment and social world of Indians. Individuals ate and married within their jati, reaffirming their membership in the collective whole. The jati system was obsessed with ideas of elite purity and lower caste pollution. Brahmins, for example, were particularly worried about physical contact with workers in the lower social orders who cleaned latrines, handled corpses, or worked with meat. The elite professions also enjoyed special privileges that were denied to subordinate populations. These core beliefs of Hinduism serve to justify this social inequality. As one's past actions determined one's status at birth, and as the jatis were hereditary, many understood karma to govern social inequality, giving it religious sanction. Likewise, an individual was obligated to follow their path in this life, not just to be a good member of society, but to fulfill their religious obligations in terms of dharma. While Varna may have been more or less universal in India, jati was a more local phenomenon. Consequently, jati has several important functions within the caste system. As jati membership made one a part of a local and self-governing community, there was less of a need for a larger state system to run society. This helps explain why India has had so few lasting empires. The caste system provided not only an identity, but also a mechanism of social support and security for vulnerable or unlucky members of a jati. Again, this meant that there was little need for a state system to deal with social issues. The jatis allowed for the creation of a new professional group for new peoples that might come into Indian society. while the Varnas allowed the wealthy and powerful to rationalize the poorly paid labor and exploitation of the lower social orders. Where does the idea of slavery come from? There are many different theories. It may have been that the domestication of animals in the Neolithic era provided a model for human slaves. It may have been an outgrowth of warfare, hierarchy, and/or patriarchy. Although the origins of slavery may be unclear, we can nonetheless state conclusively that slavery becomes a key component in many civilizations, and even more so as these civilizations become empires. While slavery is an age-old institution, it increased dramatically as classical civilizations and social inequality became more pronounced. Slaves are often described as having a social death because they typically have no rights and are deemed to be permanent outsiders to the society. Their bodies are alive, but that is about all. Throughout the world and throughout human history, there have been numerous forms of slavery, making generalizations difficult. Please pay close attention to Strayer's overview of slavery in first and second wave civilizations, not so much for this unit's test, but more so for the AP exam. The rate of slavery was higher in the Mediterranean world than in India or China. Like many other aspects of Roman culture and society, Greece served as a model for Rome. Slave ownership was widespread in Greece, with tens of thousands of slaves living in Athens, the alleged cradle of democracy and individual liberty. Roman society saw massive slave ownership, with the Italian peninsula having a slave population of between 33 and 40%. Roman slavery was often concentrated in the hands of the very wealthy and large landowners who might run estates with hundreds of slave laborers. While Strayer does not use the term latifundia, you should be familiar with it. It was essentially the Roman equivalent of plantations in the New World. After the Roman Republic became an empire, prisoners of war from the borderlands of the ever-expanding Roman Empire made up the overwhelming majority of slaves. There was no single group of enslaved peoples as compared to Africans who were enslaved in the triangle trade of the early modern era. Northern Europeans, Africans, Slavs, Jews, and others all could be caught up in the Roman slave system. However, pirates, children of slaves, and even orphan children could also be enslaved. With so much cheap labor coming into Rome, slaves could be found in every sector of the economy, from manual labor in the fields to white-collar work in the cities, or even in the gladiatorial blood sports of the Colosseums. There was little or no moral outrage over slavery, even after Christianity became the state religion. Despite the current claim by some that slaves lived decent lives under the protection of their benevolent masters, the fact remains that slaves were considered property. They had no legal rights whatsoever. In Rome, they couldn't even marry. Consequently, slaves did try against all odds to resist. Because of the tight constraints on their lives, the most common form of slave resistance could be seen in work slowdowns and sabotage. Punishments for slaves murdering their masters were extremely harsh, including killing all of the other slaves. Even so, the high number of runaways created a small industry in slave catching. However, there is one famous example of an armed revolt against slave owners, a rebellion of slaves trained for the gladiatorial games. Spartacus led a 2-year rampage of revenge up and down the Italian peninsula, freeing slaves, burning estates, and killing masters. Once the rebellion was crushed, though, the Roman Republic crucified some 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way as a warning to future rebels. There would not be another slave revolt anywhere in the world of such magnitude again until the late 18th century. Just as slavery signaled a dramatic social hierarchy, so too did increasing patriarchy in the classical era. It is worth noting, however, that patriarchy is generally less restrictive in the early years of a civilization and during times of social crisis. Moreover, women throughout history have found ways to become active agents despite their subordination. The traditional conception of the world stressed two primary functions in China, opposite yet paired, found in the yin-yang symbol. However, over time, all that was material and lowly became associated with the female yin, while the higher spiritual and moral forces were associated with the male yang. This unity of opposites helped to rationalize distinctions between men's and women's role and power within society. The Han Dynasty adopted Confucianism as its central ideology. Confucian teachings were explicitly patriarchal. For example, women were taught the 3 obediences, first to their fathers, then to their husbands, and finally to the eldest sons when widowed. Women from throughout the various social ranks found ways to exert some form of independent agency. Elite wives could influence their husbands, and concubines could influence their lovers and thus play a role in palace politics. Mothers had some power within the home due to their age, and wives held more esteem than concubines, the mistresses that men kept in their households. Due to the economic demands of the agricultural lifestyle, peasant women found it very difficult to live up to the Confucian ideals, as they had to work in the fields alongside men. After the collapse of the Han Dynasty, Confucianism was somewhat discredited, and people found new ideas in Buddhism, Taoism, and the lifestyles of the pastoral peoples to the west and north. Frequently, these new ways of living were less rigid than the Confucian ideals and placed fewer restrictions on women. The great example of an exception to Chinese patriarchy is Empress Wu, a concubine who usurped the throne and governed China for 15 years. While she moved to institute some reforms for gender equity, her brief reign as a woman was never repeated in China. Two patriarchies of two societies that are distinctly different are found in the city-state, the polis system of Greece before the Hellenization of Greece and Alexander's empire. Those two key city-states are Athens and Sparta. While Athens saw the expanding rights of male citizens as the formation of a democratic system of participation, elite Athenian women were subject to numerous legal and social restrictions. Indeed, they were not to be named or even appear in public. Athens, home of Plato's Academy, did not allow women to become educated. Women were married off in their teens to men twice their age. Since Sparta created a collective state system that stressed the military prowess of its citizens, the city emphasized physical fitness and toughness. Women were then expected also to be healthy and strong, participating in exercising and dancing. As they were out and about and very active, their styles of dress were considered revealing and scandalous by other Greeks. Their main obligation was to produce lots of healthy children who would become strong warriors or childbearers for the state. Marriage ages in Sparta were generally equal at about 18 years old. In the Reflections section, Strayer looks at the idea of which is more obvious, continuities or changes in history. And he cites two very interesting examples. The first is King Solomon, who wrote the Ecclesiastes around 920 BCE. King Solomon was the king of one of the few Hebrew states in its history. In the Ecclesiastes, he suggests that nothing is new, that everything has been tried and done before. In contrast, though, the Buddha taught in the Dhammapada that the only constant is change, that nothing is permanent. So who is right when it comes to the study of history? Well, there were significant changes in the classical era. In chapter 3, we looked at new dynasties, empires, and civilizations that rise and fall. So that's clearly a political change. In chapter 4, we noted some religious change, as the earliest religions in which you are born are replaced in many areas by universal religions that are open to anyone, and consequently use evangelism, trying to convert people into the religion. Nonetheless, there are some significant continuities after the classical era. These are the social structures that are put in place in the classical era. That's the focus of chapter 5. So the social structures in the classical era remain pretty constant throughout the majority of human history. Those four continuities include the power of the Confucian scholar gentry in China, the caste system in India, slavery in the West, and patriarchy just about everywhere. Thanks for joining me for this week's video lecture, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.